other flaws in SHA-0. A bit of a historical note, SHA-0 was the original NIST algorithm. I don't know how long after, it wasn't long after SHA-0 was replaced, NIST pulled the SHA-0 standard and released SHA-1. We had discovered an attack in SHA-0 and we'd replaced SHA. We replaced it with SHA-1, an improved version of SHA-0. Zhu has since found the attack. Zhu has probably found the most number of attacks against hash functions. So collisions exist in SHA-0. Well, they exist in every hash function, but they've been found in SHA-0. Okay, now on to MD5. The first result was by, I don't know if anyone speaks German here, can help me out with that pronunciation. Okay, we'll go with that. Found pseudo collisions in the compression function. As I mentioned, in hash function design, you take the block size of 512 bits and compress it down to the output size. This only found collisions, and they're called pseudo collisions because they only exist in the compression function. They didn't work on full MD5. The attack was of no serious consequence, but I guess the other requirement for this attack was he actually changed the IVs, which violates the standard. The IV is fixed. You can't change parts of a cipher and break it and then claim you broke the cipher. In 1996, Dobbertin discovered collisions in unmodified MD5. He didn't change the IV. He found the collisions in the MD5 compression function. So again, it wasn't of serious consequence, but because the compression function isn't the complete MD5. So, but it did make cryptographers worry or question the security of MD5 in the future. Around this time, around 1996, was when SHA-1 was being done, and people were urging cryptographers were urging users to start to move away from MD5. So now 2005 and MD5 is totally broken. People are still using it, so no one listens to cryptographers. Okay. The next major result took place last summer, and this is the one that started everything. It was when Wang, Feng, Lai, and Yu announced collisions in full MD5. Again, they haven't released all the details of the attack. They've only released the inputs that have produced the attacks. There have been some other improvements, and people can now generate collisions using sort of their scheme, but the way they did it still is not entirely known. As with most of their work, it's not entirely known. The MD5 attacks are just collision attacks, so if you have a password stored on your computer using MD5, an attacker can't invert it and he can't find a second password that produces the same hash. This only allows him to generate bunches of different messages, random messages, and find two that collide. So he can use the I will pay you $10 attack. The claim is now MD5 collisions can be generated in under an hour on a home computer, whereas before it took 2 to the 64 work, which still is beyond the computing power of anyone but the most well-financed of attackers. So MD5 collisions are now pretty trivial to find. The actual methods are still not public. One of the most interesting things that have come out of this, I believe, is the X.509 collisions. I don't know if any of you have seen this. X.509 certificates are the certificates that SSL and TLS uses. So when you go to a secure website, they present this certificate with an X.509 certificate to you. And that's how you know you're actually talking to Amazon or any of the other sites. The attack isn't really of a practical nature. I mean, you can generate colliding X.509 certificates, but I and others have thought about ways of exploiting this, and you really can't come up. Well, I'll show you the best thing that we have come up with, and you'll see that it's really not going to have a practical with the colliding X.509 certs, the requirement is all the certificate fields, like the subject name and the distinguished name and validity period, et cetera, are identical. The only thing that's different is the public key. So these two certificates collide and they produce the same hash function. So you can actually use this to present a certificate to someone, and the certificate will validate against the certificate authority, but the cert wasn't actually signed. So recall that two messages produce a collision in intermediate state, then any common text appended after the collision will lead to identical outputs. So if you begin by using the same values for every field of the certificate, the subject name, the distinguished name, et cetera, if they're identical, then they're going to produce identical hashes. So I don't know how many of you want me to actually do the math for the attack. Show of hands if they want to see the math. Okay, all right, we got some hands. Okay, not many, but the attack has, thank you, Mark. The attack makes a few assumptions, and that's that the attacker can predict the validity period and the serial number. When you have a certificate signed, you don't get to pick the validity period down to the second, and you don't get to pick the serial number that the server is going to give, the certificate authority is going to give you. So I guess it's not too unreasonable to believe that you can predict how long the cert is going to be valid, and with a lot of certificate authorities, they only increment the serial number. With each cert that they sign, they just increment the serial number. So it's not unreasonable to believe that the attacker could guess these values. One of the other requirements is that the RSA modulus fall on a 64-byte boundary, and that's because of the way MD5 is going to process the message and the way the padding scheme is going to work. Again, he makes a few assumptions in that he can predict what the subject name is going to be. If the certificate authority does something to the subject name. So the original attack by Lenstra, they gave sort of a way to ensure that the modulus is on a 64-byte boundary. But in real life, you probably don't get to do what Lenstra says, what Lenstra used. So assuming all these things hold and the attacker can do this, it's also required that he fix the exponent, and like with most RSA, he just uses the fourth Fermat number as the exponent, 2 to the 2 to the 4. Since the text is identical up to the point of the modulus, the state of both instances of the hash function are also identical. So as you process the two X.509 certs, they're identical up until the modulus starts. Next, you use the collision finding technique of weighing, and the state of the hash function up until the modulus is the IV. So the way you would process a cert normally is you go through the fields, and then you process the modulus, and the internal state of the hash function right before, as you process the modulus, is the hash of everything prior to it. So you hash the stuff prior to it and use that. You replace the IV of MD5, I'm sorry, with this hash, and use the collision finding technique to generate two different bit strings of equal length, 1024 bits. Call them B1 and B2. Okay. Now you generate two primes, P1 and P2, of approximately 512 bits, such that these primes are P minus 1 and P2 minus 1 is relatively primed to E. Now this is just basic properties of RSA here. Next, you use the Chinese remainder theorem to solve this system of congruencies. And by the Chinese remainder theorem, there is a solution. And there's actually an infinite number of solutions. I should say that when solving this, you bound it so that, right. So there's an infinite number of solutions to this system of equations. Okay, now for, I guess I'm missing part of this. Okay, so I left off something at the end of this. That's actually not a system of congruencies. This actually should be b1 times 2 to the 124 plus b sub 0, and on the second line also plus b sub 0. So you're looking for the congruency such that b1 times 2 to the 1024 is congruent to negative b sub 0 mod p1 and negative b sub 0 mod p2, which by CRT has a solution. You bound b sub 0 so that it's between 0 and p1 times p2. There's only one solution to that equation, but there's an infinite number if you don't bound it, and you'll see that in a second. Now for k equals 0 to whatever, off to infinity, you compute b equals b sub 0 plus multiples of p1 times p2. And this will give you the infinite number of solutions to that system of equations. So after generating b sub 0, you start with k1. I don't know if k0 would work. Well, yeah, it would. K0 would work. So you check k equals 0, then k equals 1, k equals 2, etc. And after you check each one of those, you compute b1 times 2 to the 1024 plus b over p1, and b2 times 2 to the 1024 plus b over p2. Eventually, you're going to end up such that these two integers, b1 times 2 to the 1024 plus b over p1 is prime. Once you have that, then you know that b1 times 2 to the 1024 plus b and b2 times 2 to the 1024 plus b are products of two distinct primes. P1 and P2 are different, and Q1 and Q2 are presumably different. I should say Q1 equals that division, but. So the modulus is now, or the two moduli are now those two integers here. Okay. Since the certificates collide up to the modulus, the internal states of the hash functions before processing the modulus are identical. Now you found a collision in the modulus, so even though the two moduli are different, they produce the same output. So after the hash functions go through the moduli, it's going to produce, again, identical states in the hash function. So now you found two different x.509 certs with the same hash function. The only thing different being the public key. The only reasonable but highly contrived scenario is, sort of where the attacker could sign something and then later claim he didn't sign it because he could just go to the certificate authority and say, look, this was signed under this key, but that's not what my key is registered as. I guess if you make all these other assumptions that he could go to court and convince a jury or a judge, raise enough reasonable doubt that he actually didn't sign it, then he may get away with it. But I mean, that's not. You're making assumptions that you can fool a jury now, for this attack to work. So, again, the attack makes a few assumptions. Solutions have been proposed by NIST and the IETF to stop this attack. The first and probably most reasonable way to do so is to simply replace the serial number with a random number plus a counter. If serial numbers are sequential, then he can predict what the next serial number is going to be. But if the CA adds a random number to the serial number, then he has no knowledge of what it's going to be. There's a few other proposed solutions, but this is probably the one that's going to be adopted. So the other are you add sort of fudge factor in the validity period where it could actually be valid for plus or minus a certain amount, and thus you can't actually fully predict the validity period. Okay, next are the SHA-1 collisions. The first major result against SHA-1 was by Vincent Reinman and Elizabeth Oswald. And it's an extension of the SHA-0 attack by Zhu. The way the attack works is SHA-1 has a bunch of nonlinear components to it. If SHA-1 was entirely linear, like with any crypto, if it's entirely linear, then it's pretty easy to break. So how the attack works is you first take out the nonlinear components and replace them with pretty good linear approximations of these components. Next,